In the golden silence of a lounge in Versailles, a woman remains still before a 17th century Venetian mirror. The reflection that contemplates it back seems sculpted in polished ivory, such an absolute perfection that it is disturbing. Its fingers, white as the snow that covers the palace gardens this winter 1856, adjust for the 10th time the pearls that adorn their neck. Each movement is calculated with the accuracy of those who know the exact weight of the look of others, each gesture measured as the notes of a symphony that has been composed for years. The blue-paved, blue silk dress whispers against the marble floor when she turns, revealing a face of almost inhuman beauty. Traces that seem to have been carved by an obsessive artist, determined to create the most beautiful woman ever existed. His eyes, described by contemporaries such as wild violets bathed in gold honey, capture the light of the crystal chandeliers and returns it multiplied, hypnotic. The lips, painted with a blood-red carmine that develops herself by mixing rare pigments, bend in a smile that does not reveal teeth, a smile that promises secrets and threatens revelations. It was December 1856, and Virginia Elisabetta, Luisa Carlotta, Antonietta, Teresa Maria Oldoini, Contessa de Castiglione, had just turned 19. At that moment, standing before the mirror that had reflected the image of Maria Antonietta decades earlier, she still did not know that her beauty would become both her crown and her arrest, a weapon she wielded against the world until the world, tired and cruel, turned against her with the same relentless force. The hall around it breathes history and decaying luxury. Gobeline tapestries cover the walls, portraying pastoral scenes where pastors impossibly beautiful porcelain shepherds. Golden furniture to the leaf shine in the wavering light of the candles, and the air carries the heavy perfume of white roses mixed with Virginia, who uses a fragrance that it commits especially from a Venetian perfumer, a secret recipe that cost it the equivalent of a duchess. She knows that within minutes the double doors will open and she will make her entrance to the most important ball of her life so far. You know that all looks will turn to her, that the conversations will cease for an eternal moment, that it will be measured, heavy, evaluated by the most demanding French aristocracy in the world. And she's ready. Not only ready, she is thirsty for this worship, hungry for the confirmation that it is, yes, the most beautiful creature that Paris has ever seen. Registration call. If you are fascinated by stories of women who have used beauty as power and luxury as a shield against a world that wanted them silenced, if you wonder about the real price of perfection and how obsession with your own image can become both salvation and condemnation, subscribe to the channel. Here we explore the lives of figures that transformed their own existence into a work of art. Even when this art cost everything they were, even when the golden frame proved to be a prison from which they could not escape. Virginia Elisabetta, Luisa Carlotta, Antonietta, Teresa Maria Oldoini was born on March 22, 1837, at the family villa in La Spezia, a property that dominated the Ligure Costa as a small particular kingdom. Daughter of Marquis Filippo Oldoini, a man of considerable fortunes and subtle political ambitions, and Isabella Lampareci, a woman whose beauty had been legendary in her youth, Virginia grew in a world where female beauty was a more valuable currency than gold, and where politics was made in halls, between fragrant whispers and unimportant eyes. The fragmented Italy of the 19th century was boiled with dreams of unification. The kingdom of Sardinia, where Virginia was born, was one of the key pieces in the great political game that would define the future of the peninsula. The women of the aristocracy knew, with an awareness that bordered the survival instinct, that their faces and bodies could influence national destinations as much as any diplomatic treaty signed in male offices. From the early years of life, Virginia has demonstrated a disturbing conscience of her own beauty. At 5, he was naturally posed when he realized that he was being observed. At 10, he had developed a refined technique to tilt his head so that the light would illuminate his profile more favoringly. At the end, he had that indefinable magnetic quality that conversations ceased when she entered an environment, not just for beauty, but by the way she carried her, as a queen conscious of her divine right to be admired. His golden brown hair, which in childhood fell into rebel curls, were tamed with the discipline of a martial art. Each morning, your French company lady hired specifically to teach you the secrets of Parisian elegance spent 2 hours combing, brushing, and arranging those precious strands. Virginia learned early that hair was not just hair. It was a frame for her face, a tool for seduction, a status symbol that needed to be kept with the devoted care to the rarest jewels. His eyes, described by contemporaries in different ways but always with a tone of almost religious reverence, were his most powerful weapon. They were not simply blue or green or brown. They changed color according to the light, the mood, the occasion. Virginia learned to control them as an actor controls her voice, modulating the intensity of the look according to the desired effect. A direct and challenging look to intimidate female rivals, a veiled and promising look to seduce men, an innocent and vulnerable look to awaken protective instincts. His education was carefully orchestrated to create not only a cultured woman, but a work of living art. She spoke Italian, French, English, and German fluently, not just for communication, but because every language offered her a new range of seductive subtleties. He studied music not only to entertain, but because he knew that a woman at the piano, with the proper light illuminating his profile while his fingers danced on the keys, was a vision that few men could forget. He learned dance not only as a social skill, but as a way to sculpt his body, to create a physical presence that occupied space with absolute authority. In January 1854, at 17, Virginia was handed over to Count Francesco Veracis di Castiglione, an elder-year-old man with a wassailing and considerable fortune. The word delivered is no exaggeration. Despite all its beauty and intelligence, Virginia was still a piece in the political matrimonial game that dominated the Italian aristocracy. But she quickly understood that even though she was a piece, she could be the most powerful piece of the board. The ceremony took place at the Church of San Martino in La Spezia, on a January morning where the Ligure mist was involved the city as a veil of omen. The marriage was an event that attracted the aristocracy from all over the region, not just for the status of the families involved, but for the morbid curiosity of seeing the young woman who was already whispered as the most beautiful of Liguria. Virginia entered the church wearing a Brussels lace dress that had cost a fortune. Each lace wire had been hand-embroidered by specialized nuns, a work that took 8 months to complete. The dress turned it into an ethereal vision of aristocratic purity, but those who knew Virginia knew that under the silk and the murmured promises, something much more complex fermented. She remained in front of the altar with the stillness of a Greek statue, but her eyes worked. Even during the most important ceremony of his life so far, Virginia was studying. He observed the reactions of the guests, mentally catalogued those who admired her with sincerity and envy, or with poison. He noticed how the light of the Gothic candles illuminated his face through the veil, how the echo of his voice resounded on the ship as he murmured the vows. Every detail was filed in your memory for future reference. Francesco, on the other side of the altar, seemed genuinely in love. He looked at her with a mixture of desire and veneration that Virginia immediately recognized. It was the look of a collector who had just acquired the rarest piece of his collection. She did not love Francesco, and this consciousness did not disturb her. Love, Virginia had already decided on the coldness of a born strategist, was a luxury that truly beautiful women could not give. Love became vulnerable, created dependencies, obscured the judgment. Marriage, on the other hand, was a pure strategy, an alliance that would give it title, financial independence, and, most importantly, access to the power circles where its beauty could flourish without the embarrassing limitations imposed on single. The first months of marital life at Palazzo Castiglione were an accelerated education in domestic power. Virginia discovered that being a countess was not just having a title. It was learning to inhabit a title, to make every gesture, every word. Each apparition confirmed her position. She studied the portraits of the previous consuls hanging on the palazzo walls, analyzing how each had chosen to present herself to posterity. Some opted for maternal dignity, some for religious piety, others for the discreet intellectuality. Virginia decided that she would be remembered by something different, by the absolute beauty transformed into political power. Francesco gave him freedoms that other aristocratic wives did not have, partially because she was genuinely fascinated by her, partially because Virginia had calculated exactly how to manipulate her generosity. He asked her for permission for things she had already decided to do, creating the illusion of deference as she got exactly what she wanted. Did you want a photo studio on Palazzo? Explained how wonderful it would be to have professional family portraits. Did you want to travel to Paris? He discussed how international experience would enrich his ability to represent the family in diplomatic circles. What Francesco didn't realize, what no one realized in those early months, was that Virginia was conducting a series of sophisticated psychological experiments. She tested the power of different types of beauty in different types of men. He found that some preferred the suggested innocence, others the obvious sophistication. Some were seduced by calculated vulnerability, others by the force disguised as femininity. Virginia cataloged these reactions with the accuracy of a scientist, creating a mental file he would use for the rest of his life. During the palazzo dinners, she tried with her presence at the table. A few nights remained almost silent, letting her beauty speak for her. Other nights dominated conversations with intelligence and charm. He observed how each approach affected male guests, how their wives reacted, what kind of power each strategy gave him. Virginia was consciously and methodically transforming into a weapon of surgical precision seduction. In 1855, Virginia's fate changed when his cousin Camillo Benso di Cavour, Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Sardinia and architect of future Italian unification, convened her to a conversation that would change her life, but potentially the course of European history. Cavour was a man who understood power in all his forms: military, economic, diplomatic, and crucially, sexual. He had identified in Virginia a singular diplomatic instrument, a woman whose beauty could open doors that traditional politics kept hermetically closed. The proposal was simultaneously simple and revolutionary. The France of Napoleon III was critical to the Italian unification plans. The French emperor, known for his susceptibility to female charm and his need for constant validation, could be influenced in ways that conventional ambassadors would never succeed. Virginia would be sent to Paris not as a diplomat's wife, but as an independent diplomatic force, such a beautiful woman that her mere presence would alter the political dynamics of imperial halls. Virginia heard the proposal with a calm that impressed even Cavour. She showed no surprise, indignation, or even particular excitement. Instead, he asked practical questions. What kind of access would she have to imperial circles? What financial resources would be at your disposal to maintain the necessary appearance? How would your reputation be protected? Or rather, how would the inevitable scandals be managed to maximize their power instead of destroying it? Cavour's answer revealed how seriously he carried out the mission. Virginia would receive a generous enough allowance to compete in luxury with the richest women in Paris. It would have access to couturiers, jewelers, and perfumers who usually served only to the imperial family. More importantly, it would have the discreet protection of intelligence services, not to limit their movements, but to ensure that each scandal was carefully orchestrated to increase its influence. Virginia arrived in Paris on a golden afternoon of October 1855, when the sheets of the newly reproved boulevards by Baron Haussmann created an amber rug under the wheels of their carriage. The city was boil with the artificial energy of the Second Empire. It was a time of calculated grandeur, of sumptuous dances that cost fortunes, of excesses that served as much to impress and to distract from underlying political instability. She initially stayed at the Du Louvre Hotel, in the pulsating heart of the city, but quickly realized that she needed something more strategic. Within 2 weeks, she had rented a Hôtel Particulier in the Rue de Castillon, a geographical irony she enjoyed with her dark humor sense. The location was no coincidence. It was at a distance calculated from the Tuileries, close enough for convenience, far enough for mystery. Virginia turned residence into a seduction theater. Each room was decorated to maximize its beauty under different types of light. The main hall had strategically positioned mirrors to create multiple reflections of itself, an effect that made visitors simultaneously hypnotized and slightly disturbed. The furniture was all in tones that complemented her skin and hair, and she had a revolutionary lighting system that allowed to adjust the intensity of the lights as the occasion. In the first weeks, Virginia frequented all the halls EU imported, but with a specific strategy. She did not try to stand out immediately. On the contrary, she remained slightly on the sidelines, creating curiosity before she satisfies her. She wore dresses that seemed to have been sewn directly over her body, but always with an unexpected detail, a color that no one else would dare to wear, a cut that suggested without revealing, a jewel put in an unusual place that forced looks to stay in it longer. Virginia cultivated an aura of mystery that made each apparition her memorable. She spoke little in the first conversations, but when she spoke, her words were chosen with surgical accuracy. Smile with parsimony, as if his smiles were rare favors that only a few privileged deserved to receive. He always left his interlocutors with the feeling that there were unlawful layers in his personality, fascinating secrets that she could eventually feel inclined to share. The strategy worked scary efficiently. Within a month, Virginia had become the subject of whispers in all important halls of Paris. It wasn't just another Italian beauty. There were Italian beauty in abundance in the French capital. It was something different, more calculated, more dangerous. Men competed for invitations to their intimate dinners. Women studied her with a mix of fascination and terror, and the social press began to mention her name often. It was at the Palace of Tuileries during a gala ball in November 1855 that Virginia found her main target, Napoleon III. The emperor, then 47 years old, was a complex figure, simultaneously powerful and insecure, charismatic and melancholy. He had come to power through a coup d'etat, and the awareness of his questionable legitimacy constantly haunted him. It was known for its susceptibility to female charm, but also for its keen intelligence and its ability to perceive obvious manipulations. Virginia had studied Napoleon III with the dedication of a general studying enemy territory. He knew his artistic tastes, his political insecurities, his need for constant validation. He knew he had been created in exile who spoke better than French English, which was fascinated by modernity, but romantic longing for the imperial past. More importantly, he knew he was married to Eugenia de Montijo, a beautiful but cold woman who has fulfilled her imperial duties with correction but without apparent passion. The approach was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Virginia did not throw himself directly toward the emperor. Such a strategy would be vulgar and easily detectable. Instead, it orchestrated a series of seemingly casual encounters, conversations that seemed spontaneous but were carefully planned. First, she positioned herself to be seen by him, but without seeming to be showing herself. During the ball, he remained in lively conversation with other guests, but always where Napoleon III could observe it. She wore a night blue dress that seemed to absorb and reflect the light of the chandeliers, creating an almost supernatural effect. Her movements were studied to look natural, the way she leaned her head as she laughed, how she wore her fan, as her jewelry captured the light when she gestured. When they were finally presented, Virginia demonstrated exactly the right combination of deference and confidence. She has made the proper but not excessive reverence. He answered his questions with enough intelligence to impress, but always with sufficient humility not to threaten. And crucially, she showed knowledge about Italian politics in a way that suggested that it could be useful, not just ornamental. The initial conversation lasted just a few minutes, but Virginia planted carefully selected seeds. He mentioned, as if it were a casual thought, his admiration for the modernization of Paris. He commented on the complexities of Italian politics in a way that revealed intimate but also feminine vulnerability. She was, after all, only a woman trying to understand the complex world of politics. And more subtly, she allowed little moments of her fascination by him to transpire. A look kept by a second more, a smile that suggested personal interest beyond social courtesy. Napoleon III was intrigued. Here was a woman who combined exceptional beauty with political intelligence, European sophistication with exotic mystery, female deference with a suggestion of inner strength. More importantly, she seemed genuinely interested in him as a person, not just as emperor, a rarity in her experience. Napoleon's seduction III was conducted by Virginia with the accuracy of a military campaign. She understood, with the intuition of a cream psychologist, that the emperor felt fundamentally insecure only his legitimacy as ruler. He had come to power through questionable means, was constantly compared unfavorably to his uncle, the great Napoleon, and faced constant political opposition. Virginia fed this wounded ego with precise doses of admiration and validation, always calibrated to seem sincere. She started sending her small gifts, nothing ostensible that could cause scandal, but carefully chosen objects that showed that she thought of him. A rare book on Italian history with a dedication that suggested admiration for his political vision. A miniature, painted by a famous artist, portraying a scene from ancient Rome that echoed his imperial ambitions. Rare flowers of his private garden, accompanied by brief tickets that combined political deference with personal heat. Virginia established a standard of communication that was simultaneously intimate and respectful. Their letters started with appropriate formalities, but gradually became more personal. She asked advice on political matters, not because she needed it, but because she knew powerful men loved to be consulted by beautiful women. He commented on art, literature, philosophy, always in a way that demonstrated that she was an interlocutor worthy of her intelligence. Even more crucial was their physical presence when they were at social events. Virginia developed a repertoire of gestures and expressions that functioned as a secret language between them. A particular look through a crowded hall that said, "I'm thinking about our conversation yesterday." A specific form of smiling when he made intelligent observation that communicated genuine admiration. A strategic use of his range, his jewelry, his posture, creating nonverbal communication that was more intimate than words. The transformation of Napoleon III was gradual but noticeable for those who knew the signs. He began to attend social events where he knew he would find Virginia. Their conversations became longer, more personal. He started looking for his opinion on matters that he would normally argue only with ministers. Virginia had become not only a beautiful woman who attracted him, but a confidant who understood her ambitions and insecurities. The brightest aspect of Virginia's strategy was how she managed the presence of Empress Eugenia. Instead of trying to compete directly or create hostility, Virginia adopted a respectful approach to deference that made Eugenia difficult to openly oppose it. She always greeted the Empress first, always referred to her with the proper titles, always showed admiration for her elegance and dignity. Virginia turned not into the Empress rival, but into a complementary presence. Where Eugenia was formal and distant, Virginia was warm and accessible. The case between Virginia and Napoleon III officially began in the winter of 1856, although the whispers about their growing intimacy had been circulating through Parisian halls for months. Virginia moved to an even more luxurious Hotel Particulier on the same street, a property that was discreetly funded through imperial channels. The residence quickly established itself as one of the most important unofficial power centers in Paris. Virginia turned her new home into an informal political hall where diplomacy, art, and seduction mingled in carefully calculated proportions. Diplomats, artists, writers, and politicians competed for invitations to their intimate dinners, where she presided over conversations with a grace that bordered the supernatural. She had developed the art of making each guest feel simultaneously special and slightly intimidated. Special because she was chosen to be there, intimidated by the awareness that she was in the presence of a woman who could influence the fate of nations. His toilettes became legendary not only for their beauty, but for the political message they carried. Virginia had more than 400 dresses, each designed for a specific occasion, each designed to maximize his visual and political impact. When he received Austrian diplomats, he used colors that subtly echoed the Italian flag. When Napoleon III visited informally, she chose shades that complemented the French imperial colors. Each choice was a statement, each apparition a silent diplomatic campaign. The relationship between Virginia and the emperor deepened beyond initial physical attraction. They shared a mutual understanding of the loneliness of power. Both had come to their positions through unconventional paths. Both faced questions about their legitimacy. Both lived public lives that isolated them emotionally. Virginia offered Napoleon III something he rarely found: a combination of genuine admiration, understanding intellectual and emotional intimacy. But Virginia never allowed emotional intimacy to obscure her political goals. She was still fundamentally an agent of Italian unification. During her intimate encounters with the emperor, she subtly planted ideas about the importance of supporting Italian nationalist movements. It did not do a direct lobby. Such an approach would be vulgar and counterproductive. Instead, she created an emotional climate where political decisions that favored Italy seemed natural, even romantic. Virginia's influence on Napoleon III has become apparent in many important political decisions. French support for the Piedmontese in the Second Italian War of Independence in 1859 was partially the result of its unofficial diplomatic efforts. Virginia had turned the Italian cause into a personal issue for the emperor, not just a political decision, but an expression of his feelings for her. During this period of maximum political influence, Virginia developed an obsession that would define the rest of her life: photography. In 1856, she began to collaborate with Pierre Louis Pierson, a photographer who quickly became both artist and complicit in her construction of an unprecedented public image. What began as some conventional portrait sessions quickly evolved into something revolutionary in the history of photography: a series of more than 400 images that exploited different facets of femininity, power, and theatricality. Virginia understood, decades in advance about communication theorists, that in an increasingly visual society, controlling her own image would be an unprecedented form of power. Her photographs were not simple studio portraits. They were theatrical staging where she explored different masks of her personality, different fantasies about what meant being a powerful woman. In the images, she appeared now as Renaissance Madonna, with ethereal veils and expression of calculated holiness, sometimes as an Oriental odalisque surrounded by luxurious fabrics and exotic musical instruments, sometimes as a Greek goddess, with classic drapes that suggested nudity without revealing it. Each photograph was designed to convey a specific message about power, beauty, and sensuality. Virginia controlled every detail: lighting, costumes, poses, scene objects. The photographic studio she established at her residence has become an identity experimentation laboratory. Virginia spent hours preparing each session, choosing not only clothes and accessories, but studying how different facial expressions conveyed different types of power. She discovered that a direct and challenging look communicated strength, but that a slightly lowered look, with her eyes raised through her eyelashes, created a seductive vulnerability that was even more powerful. The photographs served multiple purposes. Publicly, they established Virginia as an important cultural figure. Not just a beautiful woman, but an artist, a muse, a visionary of female self-expression. Privately, she used them as political gifts, sending carefully selected images to people she wanted to influence. Each photograph was a piece of personal propaganda, a way to keep your image present in people's minds, even when it was not physically present. But there was something darker in Virginia's photographic obsession. The sessions became compulsive, a psychological need that went beyond common vanity. She spent hours studying the images, analyzing every detail of her appearance, looking for imperfections that could be corrected, angles that could be improved. The photograph had become both power tool and narcissistic prison. In 1857, Virginia reached the height of his political and social influence. She had established herself as one of Paris's most powerful women, with direct access to the emperor and influence on decisions that affected the destination of millions of people. His halls were frequented by the intellectual and political elite of the time: writers like Alexandre Dumas, diplomats like Conde Walewski, artists like Winterhalter. Virginia had created a microcosm where politics, art, and seduction merged into a dangerous and fascinating alchemy. But it was precisely at the moment of greater triumph that the first signs of deterioration began to appear. The relationship with Napoleon III, intense and passionate in the early months, began to show signs of wear. The emperor, pressured by conservative public opinion and the growing duties of state, began to space his meetings with Virginia. She reacted with a toxic mixture of despair and fury, further intensifying her obsession with physical appearance. If it could not keep the emperor through the heart, and Virginia had finally admitted to herself that he felt for him was more complex than political calculation, he would keep through his eyes. She became obsessed with becoming so beautiful, so stunning, that Napoleon III could not resist returning to her. It was a desperate logic that revealed the first crack in the psychological armor that it had built over the years. Virginia began to use cosmetics increasingly dramatic and dangerous. He lightened the skin with lead, based powdered powder, painted his lips with carmine containing mercury, and outlined his eyes with kohl that gave him an almost supernatural appearance. She experimented with the chemicals imported from the East, bismutus and arsenic mixtures that promised an ethereal whiteness, but cost years of life. His photographic sessions had become more frequent and more elaborate. Virginia spent whole days preparing a single image, experimenting with dozens of costumes, testing different combinations of lights and shadows. Pearson, initially fascinated by her artistic creativity, began to be concerned about the obsessive intensity of the sessions. Virginia was no longer creating art. She was desperately trying to capture and preserve a beauty that she felt to escape between her fingers like sand. Virginia's social behavior also began to change in subtle but disturbing ways. She had become hypersensitive to any suggestion that she was no longer the most beautiful woman in the environment. When other women received praise in their presence, Virginia developed a cruel ability to make apparently innocent comments that diminished them. When men showed interest in other women, she reacted with reconquesting strategies that bordered on psychological manipulation. Even more disturbing was his growing inability to exist without constant admiration. Virginia had become addicted to the worship of others as others added to opium or alcohol. She needed continuous confirmation of her beauty to work emotionally. A day without compliments made her melancholy. A week without the center of attention made her feel like she was disappearing. In 1859, the relationship between Virginia and Napoleon III reached the official end. The emperor, facing growing political pressures and an imminent war with Austria, decided that he could no longer afford to the luxury of such a romantic scandal. The decision was communicated to Virginia through intermediaries, a humiliation she would never forgive or forget. The way the rupture was conducted revealed to Virginia how disposable she was to the man she had loved, or at least believed to love. Napoleon III did not have the courtesy of a personal conversation, offered no explanations or justifications. It simply cut contact, as if the 3 years of emotional and political intimacy had never existed. Virginia found that, despite all her influence and power, she was still fundamentally a woman in a world, controlled world, subject to their decisions, without voice or vote. Virginia's reaction was devastating and revealing. Instead of accepting the situation with aristocratic dignity, she embarked on a desperate campaign to regain the emperor. He sent passionate letters that received no response, appeared at social events wearing increasingly bold and dramatic dresses, and was to the point of trying to force casual meetings that only served to embarrass both. Virginia's erratic behavior has become the subject of malicious gossip throughout Paris. The society that previously admired her now had fun with her fall. The same halls that competed for their presence now whispered on their instability, or their lack of decorum, their inadequacy for civilized life. Virginia found that the line between being fascinating and being ridiculous was faster than he had imagined. During this dark period, Virginia made a series of social errors that permanently staining her reputation. At a reception at the British Embassy, she made a scene when she was not presented before other noble ladies. At a dinner at the Rothschild house, she insisted on monopolizing the conversation with a melancholy discussion about the transient nature of beauty. More damaging, she began to make public comments about her past relationship with the emperor, labels of label that the Parisian aristocracy considered it unforgivable. The press, which once treated her with respectful deference, began publishing increasingly cruel articles about her public appearances. Journalists who once competed to describe their beauty now had fun by pointing out signs of aging, criticizing their fashion choices as desperate or inappropriate for their age. Virginia discovered that media attention, which had been her ally for so long, could turn into deadly enemy with brutal speed. In 1860, Virginia made the decision to leave Paris. Officially, she was returning to Italy to resolve family issues. In fact, he was running away from a city that had become too hostile to endure. The Paris, who had crowned her as a beauty goddess, now whispered about her cruelty fall that she had not anticipated. She initially settled in Florence, buying a palazzo that decorated as a sanctuary dedicated to her own memory. Each room was a gallery of his photographs, his portraits, his most famous clothes preserved in windows like sacred relics. Virginia had created a museum of herself, a space where she could live surrounded only by idealized versions of her own image. Palazzo became his world. Virginia rarely came out, receiving only carefully selected visitors who could appreciate her beauty without judging her or comparing her crudely with what she had been. She developed a rigid routine that structured her days as religious rituals. He woke up at noon, spent 3 hours in beauty rituals that became increasingly elaborate and disparled, had lunch alone as he contemplated his youth portraits, devoted the afternoon to photographic sessions with Pearson, who had followed her to Italy, fascinated and horrified by her obsession. The photographic sessions intensified in an alarming way. Virginia began to photograph himself compulsively, sometimes making dozens of images a day. She experienced increasingly extreme angles, increasingly dramatic lighting, increasingly elaborate costumes. It was as if desperately trying to find the perfect angle, the perfect light, the perfect pose that would restore his lost youth. During this period, Virginia developed a pathological relationship with mirrors. The palazzo was full of them, old Venetian mirrors, ornate handed mirrors, full body mirrors that reflected their image of multiple angles. She spent hours before them, studying every change on her face, every new line that time printed on her skin. The mirrors, which had previously been allied in building their beauty, have now become merciless judges who inexorably documented their deterioration. Virginia began to wear makeup increasingly loaded and artificial. She painted her face like a porcelain doll, creating a beauty mask that became more grotesque every day. 2 red rouge on the cheeks, 2 white powder on the skin, 2 black kohl around the eyes. She had become a caricature of herself, a ghostly version of beauty that had once naturally had. As the 1860s advanced, Virginia was progressively isolated from the outside world. Their public appearances became rare, and when they happened, they were almost supernatural events that made viewers simultaneously fascinated and disturbed. It emerged in theaters, operas, and occasionally in aristocratic halls, such as an appearance of the past, always covered by veils and silks that suggested more than they revealed. The Italian press described her with a mixture of fascination and cruelty. Journalists competed to create increasingly colorful descriptions of their appearances. The mystery woman, the ghost countess, the eternal beauty that challenges time. But under the backhanded compliments, there was a chain of social sadism. Italian society was having fun with the elegant madness of a woman who couldn't accept the passage of time. Virginia developed a series of obsessive behaviors that revealed the degree of their disconnect from reality. She began to have imaginary conversations with Napoleon III, who had died in 1873. She prepared dinners for 2, wore her best dresses to receive him, and spent hours talking alone about the old golden days when she was the most powerful woman in Paris. The servants, initially disturbed by these melancholy rituals, ended up getting used to and participating in fantasy for pity. Even more disturbing was his growing obsession with beautiful women. Virginia began to invite girls from the Florentine aristocracy to visits to her palazzo, ostensibly to mentor them in the art of elegance, but the sessions became cruel exercises where Virginia obsessively compared their own appearance with that of visitors, making comments that revealed toxic envy of the youth of others. She developed elaborate theories about preserving the beauty that bordered on medieval alchemy. Virginia experimented with ointments made of ground pearls, mare milk baths, liquid gold facial masks. He spent fortunes on healers who promised to restore his youth with chemicals who claimed to have developed elixirs of eternal youth. The search for lost beauty had become a scientific obsession that consumed both his fortune and his sanity. The photographs of this period reveals a woman at war with herself. Virginia appears increasingly masked, more artificial, more desperate. She wears veils that cover parts of her face, poses that hide signs of aging, such dramatic lighting that she creates shadowing more than revelations. The images are simultaneously beautiful and haunted, portraits of a woman who was literally disappearing behind her own attempts to preserve. In 1872, Virginia made the surprising decision to return to Paris. The city had changed dramatically during its absence. The Franco-Prussian War, the Commune, the fall of the Second Empire had transformed both the physical landscape and the social climate. Virginia's Paris, found, was no longer the golden imperial capital she had known, but a bourgeois republic that had little time for aristocratic nostalgia. She settled in a smaller apartment in Place Vendôme, decorated entirely in shades of blue and silver, the colors that had highlighted her beauty in youth. The apartment was like a luxury mausoleum, where each object had been chosen to complement the image she wanted to project. But now there was something ghostly in decoration, as if she were creating a scenario to represent a piece about her own life. Virginia constantly wearing veils when she left, not by religious modesty, but to preserve the mystery of her decaying beauty. She developed the theory that being too seen had worn out her image during the years of glory, and now she was trying to regain power through strategic concealment. The veils became increasingly elaborate, becoming textile sculptures that involved their body as ethereal armor. Its rare public appearances have become almost theatrical events. Virginia emerged in operas or halls as a legend figure, moving through environments with a studied grace that seemed both majestic and pathetic. She spoke little, smiled even less, and kept an aura of mystery that forced people to wonder what hid under the veils and silks. New Paris, however, had little patience for aristocratic melodramas. Republican society, via Virginia, as a curious relic of a dead time, interesting as an object of study but irrelevant to contemporary life. The halls she attended were populated by people who treated her with formal courtesy, but without the genuine fascination she had inspired by the past. Virginia reacted to this indifference, further intensifying her theatricality. She began wearing increasingly elaborate and anachronistic clothes, as if she was constantly costumed for an imperial mask ball. Her jewels were so many that she looked more like a street shower than a royal woman. The effect was simultaneously impressive and disturbing. It had become a living performance of wealth and beauty, but a performance that no one had asked to see. During his last years in Paris, Virginia has developed a morbid obsession with her own mortality. She went to cemeteries, especially the Père Lachaise, where she walked between the tombs as if choosing her future home. These visits were not melancholy in the traditional sense. Virginia seemed to find a strange peace in the company of the dead, as if finally found an audience that did not judge her for her decaying appearance. She also developed a disturbing fixation with her own old photographs. Virginia spent hours contemplating the images of her youth, sometimes talking to them as if they were living people. "You were so beautiful," she murmured to a portrait of 1856. "Why did you leave me?" he whispered to an image of 1859. The servants found it sleeping, hugging his photographs, as if he tried to absorb the lost beauty through physical contact. Virginia began writing letters for dead people, especially to Napoleon III, who had died in 1873. These letters, discovered after her death, reveal a fragmented mind between reality and fantasy. She described events as if he was still alive, made plans for future meetings, and showed a growing disability of accepting that that time of her life had ended forever. Even more disturbing was his relationship with mirrors. Virginia had developed the habit of covering all the mirrors of the apartment during the day, discovering them only during their night makeup sessions. She explained to the servants that the mirrors kept bad images during the day, but at night showed the truth. It was a delusional logic that revealed the degree of his disconnection of reality. Night makeup sessions became almost religious rituals. Virginia spent hours applying layers of cosmetics, creating a mask, the beauty that became more artificial each night. She used enough rouge to paint a wall, white powder that made her look like an elegant corpse, and coal that turned her eyes into black holes in her spectral face. In 1895, Virginia made a decision that shocked the few friends who still kept in touch with her. He decided to give a party, the first in decades, to celebrate his eternal beauty. The invitation, written in a shaking handout that revealed his 78 years, promised a night of imperial elegance in a vulgar Republican era. The preparation for the party consumed months. Virginia spent fortunes on decorations, hired the best suppliers in Paris, and ordered a dress that cost more than a worker's annual salary. She wanted to recreate the atmosphere of the great dances of the Second Empire, as if, through the strength of will and luxury, to resurrect a dead time. The dress chosen for the occasion was a masterpiece of denial of reality, made of Pavor blue silk, its color signature covered with pearls and diamonds, with a 3-meter tail that required 2, created to carry. Virginia used it with all his most important jewels, becoming a human constellation of precious stones. The effect was simultaneously magnificent and grotesque. She looked like a gigantic doll dressed by an obsessive collector. The party was a magnificent social disaster. Of the 100 guests, only 20 attended, mainly out of morbid curiosity. Virginia entered the hall as an appearance of another century, moving with a studied grace that could not completely hide the fragility of her movements. She smiled at guests who whispered with each other, gave gifts to people who looked at her with a mixture of fascination and horror, and danced alone while an orchestra played imperial waltzes. The culmination of the night was when Virginia went up on a small platform and gave a speech about the eternal importance of beauty in a world that had forgotten what was truly valuable. His voice, still melodious despite his age, echoed in a salon where guests did not know if he applaud or escape. She spoke for 20 minutes about her golden age, about the powerful men she had known, about beauty as a supreme form of art. When he finally got out of the platform, Virginia found a semi-ways. Most guests had broken discreetly during their speech, unable to support a woman's show, desperately trying to resurrect a version of herself who had died decades earlier. She ended the night dancing alone with ghosts, while the musicians played for a portrait and mirrors audience. Virginia's last 4 years of life were marked by a loneliness that no luxury amount could soften. She lived surrounded by hundreds of photographs of her, but had lost almost all real human contacts. Her old lovers had died or forgotten her. Her friends considered her a pathetic ghost of the past, and she had become a prisoner of the legend she had created. Virginia developed a daily routine that revealed her growing disconnection of reality. He woke up at 2 in the afternoon, spent 4 hours getting ready as if to leave, but rarely left the apartment. I had lunch alone in imperial porcelain, talking to portraits of Napoleon III as if he was present. He passed the afternoons dictating memories to a secretary who transcribed interspersed delusions with fragments of lucidity. His memories, never published during his life, reveal a fragmented mind between different versions of herself. Sometimes, she wrote, as if she was still the young Countess of 19 years old arriving in Paris. Other times, he assumed the perspective of the powerful woman who had influenced emperors. Occasionally, moments of devastating clarity made her recognize what she had become, an old woman alone, living on memories in a Paris that had forgotten her existence. Virginia died on November 28, 1899, 62, alone in her apartment in Place Vendôme. It was found 3 days later by a servant who came daily but did not dare to disturb her boss when she rested. Virginia was sitting on her favorite armchair, wearing one of her most elaborate blue dresses, with all her main jewels, as if she had prepared for a last ball she never arrived. About her dressing table, Carefully positioned to be the first thing seen by those who entered the room, there was a photograph of 1856. She, at the age of 19, in the absolute height of her beauty, looking straight at the camera with that confident challenge expression that had made her famous. It was as if, in the end, she wanted to be remembered not for what she had become, but for what she was once. APA, where he died, was a macabre museum of his own obsession. Each wall was covered with their photographs at different ages and poses. Whole cabinets contained dresses that had never worn again, organized by color and time as a file of a life dedicated to appearance. Dozens of mirrors infinitely reflected the empty space, creating a multiplication effect that suggested an eternity of loneliness. The inventory of Virginia's goods, conducted weeks after his death, revealed the frightening extension of his obsession with his own image. She had more than 800 dresses, metallicously catalogued by date of acquisition and occasion of use. It had 1,200 pairs of shoes, many never used. Her jewels, evaluated by experts, included pieces that had belonged to French royalty, gifts from Napoleon III that she had never sold, even in times of greater financial difficulty. Even more impressive was his collection of cosmetics and beauty products. Virginia had ointments and potions from around the world, creams made with sick pearls from the East, rare Arabia perfumes, hair dyeing developed by Swiss chemicals. She had spent fortunes on products that promised to preserve or restore youth, turning her apartment into a kind of alchemical laboratory dedicated to the pursuit of eternal beauty. But perhaps the most revealing discovery was its correspondence. Virginia had kept every letter received in her life, thousands of them, chronologically organized on imported leather chests. The letters of the early years were admirers, politicians, artists, all seduced by their beauty and power. The letters of recent years were mainly from suppliers charging debt, lawyers discussing financial issues, and doctors offering treatments for preserving appearance. The inventory also revealed that Virginia had literally invested all her wealth in her own appearance. Despite receiving considerable fortunes throughout his life, gifts from lovers, family inheritance, rental lace, she died with substantial debts. Each franc had been spent on dresses, jewelry, cosmetics, beauty treatments, photographic sessions. She had turned her life into a work of art too expensive to be sustained. The photographs found in his apartment, more than 2,000 negatives and copies, obsessively documented every phase of his life. There were images of her from the 19th age, a visual file that revealed both extraordinary beauty and her gradual deterioration. The latest photographs, taken a few months before his death, showed an unrecognizable woman, so masked by makeup and veils that looked more like a haunted doll than a human being. Virginia's funeral was a small and melancholy ceremony at the Saint-Roch Church in Paris on a cold morning of December 1899. Only a few faithful, known and curiously attracted to the notoriety of his death, attended. No one from the old imperial court, no one of the halls she had dominated, none of the powerful men who once competed for her attention. His coffin was covered with blue flowers, iris, jacintos, lumps, creating a sea of his favorite color that dramatically contrasted with the cold marble of the church. Virginia was buried wearing the paving blue silk dress that had been her trademark, with her most precious pearls and the diamond tiara that Napoleon III had given her in 1857. Even in death, she insisted on maintaining appearances. In the French newspapers, the obituaries were brief and formal. Le Figaro described her as one of the great beauties of the Second Empire, a striking figure of imperial halls. Le Temps mentioned his influence on the diplomatic circles of the Napoleonic time, but there was a coldness to protocol and compliments, as if it were a more historical curiosity than a real person who had lived, loved, and suffered. The Italian press was slightly more generous, perhaps for national pride. Il Corriere della Sera published a longer article about the Countess who embodied Italian elegance in Paris, but even so, the tone was distant, almost anthropological. Virginia had become a footnote in 19th century history, a colorful anecdote about the excesses of the Second Empire. Its history was quickly absorbed by the golden legend of the Napoleonic time, becoming a ballroom anecdote about the times when women knew to be truly feminine. The complexity of his life, political ambitions, strategic intelligence, desperate struggle against aging, the devastating loneliness of recent years, has been reduced to a romantic caricature of the bella Italian that seduced an emperor. But the photographs remained, hundreds of them, creating an obsessive visual file of a woman who had turned Vaidad, and in art and psychological prison. Each image tells a different story. Virginia as a classic goddess, as an oriental seductive, as a devout mother, as a melancholy widow, as a ghost of herself. Together they form a devastating psychological portrait of a woman who had lost the ability to exist outside her own image. Virginia's photographs with Pearson are now recognized as revolutionary in the history of photographic art. They anticipated in decades concepts that would only become common in the 20th century: the conscious construction of identity through image, photography as performance, the exploration of different personas through self-portrait. Virginia had unknowingly created one of the first personal image construction campaigns in modern history. But there is something haunted in the images that goes beyond its artistic importance. They document not only an exceptionally beautiful woman, but a soul in gradual disintegration. The first photographs show radiant confidence, conscious power of oneself, beauty that is known irresistible. The latter revealed disguised despair, a pathetic struggle against time, a woman drowning in her own image. Contemporary scholars see in Virginia's photographs a disturbing foreshadowing of modern visual culture. She anticipated our era of selfies and filters, obsessive building of digital persona, constant performance of identity. Virginia understood, a century in advance, that in a growing visual society, controlling his own image would be a form of power, but also discovered, in the most cruel way, that this power had a devastating psychological price. The images continue to fascinate and disturb contemporary viewers precisely because we recognize something familiar in the obsession of Virginia. At a time when millions of people compulsively document their lives through images, where physical appearance has become social currency, where digital filters allow everyone to create idealized versions of themselves, Virginia emerges as a tragic prophet of modern narcissism. Virginia Oldoini died as her last years had lived, watching herself, lost in an infinite gallery of self, image that she had become both her kingdom and her prison. His life was a 6 decades performance, an audacious and finally tragic attempt to transform human existence into a permanent spectacle. It understood, before any communication theorist, that in an increasingly visual society, controlling its own appearance was a form of political and social power. But Virginia also discovered, as brutally as possible, that this power was priced to pay. Her obsessive pursuit of eternal beauty has become a sophisticated form of self. Destruction? A golden prison where she became the guardian and the prisoner simultaneously. Its history resonates today with an urgency that is almost unbearable. In a world where personal image has become a current currency, where women are simultaneously empowered and imprisoned by their appearance, where social networks have become obsessive curators of their own personas, Virginia Oldoini emerges as a prophetic figure that anticipated the psychological dangers of modern visual culture. It teaches us that beauty, when it becomes total obsession, becomes a form of elegant madness. Virginia wanted to be eternal through the image, but found that the images, however perfect, cannot replace real life. In the end, she was not remembered for her sophisticated political intrigue, her real influence on Italian unification, or her strategic intelligence, but just for her appearance, exactly what she had wanted as a young man, and exactly what she condemned her as a complex and real person. Virginia transformed her life into a work of living art, but forgot that works of art, however beautiful, are silent objects, admired at a distance, unable to love or be loved back. She got everything she wanted. Beauty that crossed centuries, a fame that survived death, images that still fascinate spectators more than a century later. But it has lost the only thing that really matters, the ability to be genuinely human. In the Versailles mirrors, where she once beholed with absolute confidence, other women continue to look at each other, adjusting their masks, preparing their performances for a world that first judges them by appearance. Virginia Oldoini's reflection remains there, multiplied infinitely through the centuries, reminding us that the line between art and madness, between power and prison, between being seen and truly known, is faster than we would like to admit. At Place Vendôme, where she lived her last lonely years, tourists pass unknowingly that one of the most photographed women of the 19th century resided. Your Conti window naked there blinds now to the world that she so wished to conquer through pure beauty. And perhaps this is the most cruel lesson that your life leaves us, that no matter how perfectly we see ourselves reflected in the mirrors we create for ourselves, if we can't see beyond our own image, we eventually disappear completely, leaving only yellowish photographs as proof that we once existed. Virginia Oldoini was a woman who anticipated in decades issues that only now we begin to understand about female identity, image, and power. She lived and died as an elegant warning about the dangers of transforming her own existence into constant performance. Your legacy is not just the extraordinary photographs you have created, but the haunting question your life echoes over the centuries. What is the real price of being seen, and is it worth paying it when the cost is the soul itself? In the end, Virginia teaches us that true beauty is not perfectly in the image, but in the courage to exist authentically, even when it means accepting our own imperfection and mortality. She chose the opposite way and became immortal, but an immortality made of glass and shadows, beautiful from afar, devastatingly leaked closely. It is a kind of eternity that no soul should wish for itself.